Here we keep you entertained by our folk tales and true life stories. Please subscribe to our channel as it means the world to us. Also, please like, share, and comment on this channel for more exclusive contents. Now sit back and relax as we take you through the most wonderful epistle. The hill rose like a quiet command above the cedar-lined road, and the Lancaster estate crowned it with the kind of certainty that made clocks feel late. Clara Dawson stepped from the staff shuttle with her canvas duffel and a heart that sounded too loud in her own ears. The main house spread in pale stone and glass, sunlight breaking across its many windows as if the day itself were curtsying. Mrs. Kent, the head housekeeper, met her at the service entrance with a clipboard and the brisk grace of a metronome. "We run on rhythms here, not guesses," she said, leading Clara through back corridors that smelled of lemon oil and starch. The tour unfurled with choreography, laundry rooms humming. A silver pantry catalogued like a museum, the green baize door that separated staff passageways from guest corridors, the intercoms, the coded service bells, the linen schedule by day and thread count, the instruction never to cross the east gallery when the red light above the arch glowed. They paused at a side window where Jonas, the gardener, trimmed a stubborn hedge with gentle patience, his hat tilted like a shield against the noon. In the kitchen, Emily, the cook, lifted her eyes from a pot of stock and smiled at Clara the way a lighthouse smiles at small boats. Somewhere deeper in the house a chime sang, and Mrs. Kent's pencil checked boxes as if she were counting secrets. "You'll learn," she said. "But learn quietly." In the hush that followed, Clara heard what the hush itself implied. This was a home that expected perfection because the man who owned it could afford nothing else. Before today, the closest Clara had come to opulence was the wedding reception she'd served at a harbor hotel, the one where she'd balanced a tray of champagne while watching a chandelier scatter light like diamonds over strangers' laughter. She'd grown up 2 hours north, in a salt-bright town where boats left before dawn and came back with either luck or stories. Her father, a fisherman with hands like rope, never returned from a winter storm when she was 11, and the town carried that fact the way a knuckle carries a scar. Her mother's health frayed after, nothing dramatic, just the slow unravel, prescriptions, careful budgets, quiet courage. At 14, Clara folded laundry at a motel. At 16, she worked the overnight register at a gas station, studying on a stool between customers. She dreamed in spreadsheets and seating charts, teaching herself hospitality from borrowed textbooks and obsessive notes. She learned to iron shirts so crisp they sounded like paper, to read people by the temperature of their smiles, and to send half her pay home without fail. When a staffing agency called about a position with discretion required in the outskirts of the city, not Africa, not anything like the stories told about faraway places, just New England granite and winter pines, she said yes because saying no had never once bought medicine. Her hobbies were small and stubborn, sketching floor plans in spiral notebooks, watching tutorial videos on event service etiquette, collecting words like concierge and mise en place and holding them like charms. She wanted a credential one day, a proper certificate in hotel management, her name embossed in blue foil above a future that would not require apology. By afternoon, the house had tested her twice. First, with a tray of porcelain teacups thin as moonlight, Lancaster china, Emily whispered, "Do not breathe on it," and then with a runner on the grand staircase that wrinkled like a frown no matter how she smoothed it. Mrs. Kent noticed everything without ever seeming to look. Approval in this place arrived as the absence of correction. Clara learned the map of rooms by scent, wax and walnut in the library, citrus and linen where guest suites slept between visits, old stone and rain near the conservatory where Jonas's seedlings reached for kind windows. She learned the rules that weren't in the manual: never step into a mirror when wiping it, appearances are for them, invisibility for us. Never leave a cart in a corridor, never ask questions that make people remember you asked them. "Mr. Lancaster is private," Mrs. Kent said, and the word private felt heavier than rich. In the evening lull, as Emily plated staff supper and Jonas came in with clippings that smelled like July, Clara caught it, the way the air changed when distant footsteps crossed polished floors upstairs. The way the intercom clicked alive and died again, the way a house could hold its breath for one man. She didn't see him, she only heard the tempered cadence of a life measured out in decisive steps. Whispers traveled the back hall like wind, about meetings that ended before they began, about generosity delivered quietly, about a widower who made time obey him but never asked it to be kind. Clara folded a napkin into a perfect bishop's hat and understood that she had entered a story already in motion. She also understood, with a shiver she couldn't name, that the house would remember everything she did, especially the moments when no one was supposed to be watching. Alexander Lancaster was the kind of man whose presence redrew the air, a shift so subtle you realized it only when the quiet felt different. At 42, he carried the stillness of someone who had already climbed every mountain he cared to, and now chose which valleys to walk through. His empire sprawled across industries, real estate, luxury retail, and a portfolio of discreet investments in tech, but his home life was a fortress no tabloid could breach. His late wife, Isabella, had been the light that softened him. Her death from ovarian cancer 5 years ago had left a gap in the mansion that even the sunlight seemed to respect. Alexander's days began before dawn, his routines deliberate, an hour in his study with black coffee, morning calls with European partners, a private driver to the city and back. Staff whispered about his efficiency, about the rare smiles reserved for one person, his 7-year-old son, Ethan. He had not dated publicly since Isabella's funeral, his name conspicuously absent from gossip columns. To Clara, glimpses of him were like seeing a figure in an oil painting step briefly into daylight, precise, deliberate, and entirely beyond her world. Ethan Lancaster was the opposite of his father in most visible ways. Where Alexander's gaze was level and unreadable, Ethan's was wide and curious, always flicking to windows, to sky, to anything that glittered like a secret. He had inherited his mother's soft curls and her habit of sketching absent-mindedly on any scrap of paper. Astronomy fascinated him, his bedroom ceiling was dotted with glow-in-the-dark constellations, and he owned a small telescope perched near the balcony. But the boy's shyness was a shell made of grief. Isabella had been his anchor, and losing her at 2 years old left him adrift. Even with Alexander's devoted care, there were afternoons when Ethan would slip into the library with a blanket and read until dusk without speaking. His world was small. Veronica Lancaster, Alexander's younger sister, who visited weekly bearing stories and sweets. Mrs. Kent, who enforced bedtime with military precision, and Emily, who baked him cinnamon bread when the weather turned gray. When Clara first saw him, curled in a chair in the sunroom, tracing planets in a book, he gave her a polite nod but didn't speak. She recognized the look in his eyes. It was the same one she'd worn for years after her father vanished beneath a storm. Veronica Lancaster was unlike her brother in temperament, warm, outspoken, quick to laugh, but the same in loyalty. 10 years younger than Alexander, she had been a constant in Ethan's life since Isabella's passing, serving as a bridge between the boy and his often absorbed father. She ran a small art gallery in the city, choosing pieces with a curatorial instinct as sharp as Alexander's business acumen. Veronica saw through people quickly, and she took to Clara almost immediately during their first introduction in the garden. "You have the hands of someone who works hard and the eyes of someone who notices," she said, half teasing, half testing. Over supper in the staff hall, Jonas explained that Veronica had been the one to convince Alexander to keep the estate staff small and familial, rather than hiring a revolving door of professionals. Emily added that the sister was fiercely protective of Ethan. Rumor had it she once had a heated argument with a former governess who tried to force the boy into a public speaking event. Clara listened quietly, piecing together the household dynamics. She didn't yet know how deeply she would be woven into them, or that in time she would become not just a bystander but a keystone in the fragile architecture of the Lancaster family. But that night, as she tidied the library and overheard Ethan laughing softly at something Veronica said, she felt the first quiet thread of connection to this house and its guarded occupants. The announcement came quietly, though in the Lancaster estate, even quiet had a way of echoing. Mrs. Kent gathered the staff in the service hallway one crisp October morning and informed them that Alexander Lancaster had remarried in a private ceremony abroad. No photographs, no public fanfare, just the sudden arrival of Vanessa Harper Lancaster, a 29-year-old socialite whose name, Clara learned later, was more familiar in fashion columns than in business circles. The first time Clara saw her was from the edge of the grand foyer, polishing the silver banister. Vanessa stepped through the massive oak doors like she'd been born for thresholds, her blonde hair catching the sunlight, her heels clicking in perfect rhythm against the marble. The diamond on her finger caught more light than her smile, which she offered sparingly to staff before glancing past them as though they were expensive furniture, necessary but unremarkable. Mrs. Kent's face didn't change, but Clara saw her eyes sharpen. This was a house accustomed to dignity, and Vanessa's arrival felt like a gust of wind in a room of fragile glass. Vanessa's reputation preceded her, though not in the way that inspired respect. Over the next week, Clara pieced together the picture through overheard staff conversations and the occasional gossip magazine Jonas left in the break room. Born into an upper-middle-class family in Miami, Vanessa had quickly climbed the social ladder through a series of high-profile relationships. Her past boyfriends included a professional athlete, an art dealer, and the heir to a shipping fortune. Each connection ended with expensive gifts left behind and rumors of her temper whispered in upscale clubs. She had a taste for luxury that bordered on theatrical, handbags that cost more than the annual staff budget, imported champagne at lunch, and an aversion to anything she deemed commonplace. Alexander, it seemed, had met her at a charity gala in New York. What had drawn him to her was anyone's guess, though Clara suspected it might have been the rare sight of Alexander smiling in public. But in the staff quarters, there was quiet apprehension. Vanessa had brought no personal staff of her own, meaning she intended to bend the existing household to her will. The first signs of that will appeared within days. Vanessa inspected her new suite and declared the curtains depressing, ordering Clara to oversee their replacement with imported silk. She complained that the coffee was too bitter, sending Emily into a week-long experiment with blends and brewing methods. Ethan, who had been cautiously polite at their first introduction, began avoiding her after she criticized his posture at the breakfast table. Clara noticed the way Vanessa's voice softened whenever Alexander was in the room, only to harden into clipped commands the moment he left for work. To the outside world, Vanessa was poised and charming, her Instagram feed filled with artfully staged photos of the estate gardens, her arm looped through Alexander's at charity luncheons. Inside the mansion, however, the staff moved with the wary precision of sailors navigating a reef. Clara kept her head down, speaking little and observing much, but she couldn't ignore the tightening knot in her stomach each time she saw Vanessa glance at Ethan with the same detached appraisal she gave the furniture. Something about it felt like the first note of a song Clara had heard before, the kind that starts sweet but turns into a storm. It began subtly, like a crack in fine porcelain, small enough to ignore until it spread. Vanessa's cruelty wasn't the loud, table-flipping kind. It was quieter, sharper, meant to wound without leaving visible bruises. One morning over breakfast, she asked Ethan to name all the capitals of Europe in front of her visiting friends. When the boy hesitated after Vienna, her lips curved into a cold smile. "Oh dear, I thought Lancaster children were supposed to be brilliant," she said, earning polite chuckles from her guests. Alexander was in the city that day, so no one saw Ethan's ears redden as he pushed away his toast. Later, in the kitchen, Clara found him hunched over a book, his small fingers gripping the pages as if knowledge could be crammed into them fast enough to keep him safe from her jabs. Clara didn't comfort him with platitudes. Instead, she sat beside him and pointed out the constellations in the atlas, letting him guide the conversation back to something that felt like wonder. The staff bore their share of Vanessa's temper. Jonas was once sent back to replant an entire flower bed because the petals clashed with the cushions in the garden pavilion. Emily, who had cooked for the Lancasters for 15 years, was told her pastries were stodgy and ordered to throw them out, right in front of the man from the delivery truck, who looked away in embarrassment. Clara herself was given impossible tasks, polishing the brass banisters in under 20 minutes, ironing tablecloths so large they barely fit in a laundry press. There were no raised voices, no open threats, just that silken tone that made refusal impossible without inviting retaliation. Even Mrs. Kent, whose composure could survive hurricanes, walked the halls with tighter shoulders. Outside, the estate gardens bloomed under Jonas's care, the hedges neat and roses heavy with fragrance. Inside, the atmosphere wilted. But Clara's bond with Ethan deepened in the shadows Vanessa cast. On her short breaks, she'd find him in the conservatory, sketching planets or reading by the wide windows. They shared stories in quiet tones, Clara telling him about the fishing boats of her childhood, Ethan explaining how Saturn's rings were made mostly of ice. She began to notice how his laughter was different when Alexander was away, more cautious, as though happiness needed permission. Meanwhile, life beyond the mansion kept moving. Emily's son sent letters from his military posting overseas, each one read aloud in the kitchen like a small event. Jonas entered his prized roses into the county horticulture competition, tending them in the early mornings when the mist still clung to the grass. Clara sent part of her wages home, knowing her mother's medication refill was due. Vanessa's shadow was long, but not absolute. Small pockets of warmth survived in the estate. Still, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that the line between quiet cruelty and open harm was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. And sooner or later, she feared, that line would snap. Winter came early that year, bringing with it the kind of cold that painted frost along the mansion's tall windows and turned the gardens into a glassy dream. The estate's schedule shifted with the season, fires lit in every hearth, heavier drapes drawn at dusk, and a constant scent of cinnamon and pine wafting from Emily's kitchen. It was during these colder weeks that Clara and Ethan's friendship took on a deeper shape. She would find him in the library after school, curled up in the same leather chair with a blanket over his knees, a stack of astronomy books balanced beside him. Some evenings, she read aloud while he traced constellations on a star map. Other times, they stepped onto the frost-silver balcony outside his room to peer through his telescope, their breath fogging the eyepiece. Clara told him stories about the ocean and how fishermen navigated by the stars when compasses failed, and Ethan, in return, showed her the small scrapbook he kept of his mother, drawings, photographs, pressed flowers from her garden. In these quiet hours, it was as though the mansion itself relaxed, the walls forgetting to listen. Alexander began to notice changes, though he didn't yet understand their cause. He saw Ethan smiling more at dinner, laughing over small things, even venturing to share facts about planets or ships without being prompted. One evening, as Alexander passed the library, he caught sight of Clara and Ethan bent over a book, their heads close, the boys' laughter spilling into the hall. He didn't interrupt, but a flicker of curiosity settled in his mind. Outside the warmth of the home, Alexander's world was as relentless as ever, morning conference calls with his overseas partners, a tense negotiation over a commercial property in Boston, and meetings with his trusted lawyer, Henry Cole, to review a merger contract. His oldest friend, Richard Marlowe, a media mogul with a flair for blunt honesty, teased him over dinner one night, "You've been smiling more lately, Alex. That's either good business or good company." Alexander brushed it off, but the observation lingered. Meanwhile, Vanessa was in the midst of planning what she called her Winter Crown Gala, an event designed to position her as a leading hostess in New England's social circuit. Her focus on the gala was absolute: florists interviewed, chefs consulted, decorators summoned. To the staff, her preparations meant long hours and exacting demands. To Alexander, it was just another project she pursued with obsessive detail. Clara kept her head down, tending to her duties, but she couldn't ignore the subtle shift in the household rhythm. Vanessa's attention was fixed outward, on dazzling guests and curating her image, which left Ethan freer to spend his afternoons as he wished. Those afternoons became a sanctuary for the boy and for Clara, moments where laughter and stories replaced the careful silences of the rest of the day. Yet beneath the frost and glow of the approaching holiday season, Clara sensed that these moments were fragile, balanced on a line she could neither name nor control. Somewhere in the quiet, the first hints of something larger, both tender and dangerous, were beginning to stir. The Winter Crown Gala arrived with a kind of fever that infected the entire estate. For days beforehand, delivery trucks came and went, cases of fine wine, gilded centerpieces, crystal glassware so delicate Clara held her breath when she carried it. Vanessa treated the preparations like a coronation, barking last-minute orders, adjusting floral arrangements by millimeters, and changing seating charts until the ink bled through the paper. The night itself unfolded like a scene from one of those glossy society magazines, music from a live quartet, waiters in black ties moving like clockwork, guests shimmering in sequins and silk. Alexander was the perfect host, moving through the crowd with a glass in hand, polite yet distant. Clara worked silently among the staff, replenishing trays and refilling glasses, careful to remain invisible. But she saw the tension in Alexander's jaw when Vanessa, resplendent in a silver gown, leaned in far too close to Daniel Pierce, Richard Marlowe's young assistant, laughing at something whispered in her ear. Alexander's eyes narrowed just slightly, enough for Clara to catch but not enough for the room to notice. Later that night, as the gala waned and Clara carried linens down the staff corridor, she heard a muffled voice behind a partially closed door. Vanessa's unmistakable tone floated through, dripping with disdain. "He's so predictable. Brilliant in business, utterly boring in life," she said, the soft clink of glass punctuating her words. Clara froze, the weight of the laundry in her arms suddenly heavier. Vanessa's companion chuckled, murmuring something Clara couldn't hear. "Don't worry," Vanessa replied, "I have plans. Big ones. I'm not about to play house forever." The words slipped under Clara's skin, chilling her more than the icy draft from the window at the corridor's end. She stepped back, heart pounding, careful not to be seen. She knew better than to repeat what she'd overheard. Loyalty in this house was a currency, and she had none to spare, but the unease it stirred was hard to shake. In the days that followed, the staff spoke of the gala's success with the measured politeness of people who knew better than to speak their real thoughts aloud. Vanessa was triumphant, her social media flooded with pictures of her in that silver gown, arm looped through Alexander's, every caption a curated testament to perfection. Yet behind the scenes, the atmosphere had shifted. Ethan seemed more withdrawn, spending longer hours in the library. One afternoon, he handed Clara a drawing, a careful sketch of the night sky, a small figure standing beneath it. "That's you," he said simply, "my friend." Clara smiled, but the warmth was tinged with worry. She had no proof, no evidence beyond overheard whispers, yet she felt certain that something in Vanessa's plans would not end quietly. The mansion's polished glass still gleamed in the winter sun, but Clara could feel the fractures spreading beneath the surface, invisible until the moment they'd shatter. It was a Sunday afternoon when Vanessa returned from an upscale shopping trip carrying more bags than a single person could comfortably hold. Clara, dusting the banisters in the grand staircase, watched her set them down on the marble floor with theatrical flair. Among the designer dresses and imported perfumes was a sleek, top-of-the-line hairdryer, metallic gold, still in its pristine packaging. Vanessa waved it at Mrs. Kent as though presenting a royal scepter. "Imported from Milan. Not like those dreadful, ordinary ones," she said, already striding toward her suite. That evening, the atmosphere in the house shifted again. At dinner, Ethan accidentally tipped over his juice glass, the amber liquid pooling toward Vanessa's plate. She pulled back sharply, her lips curling into a scowl. "Honestly, must you always be so clumsy?" she said in a low, cutting voice before turning to Clara. "Clean it up. Now." Alexander, due to leave for a short business trip the next morning, didn't catch the exchange. Clara's hands moved quickly with the cloth, but her mind lingered on the look in Ethan's eyes, hurt, embarrassment, and a quiet kind of resignation that had no place in a child's gaze. The next day, the mansion was unusually quiet. Alexander's sleek black sedan had pulled away before dawn, and Vanessa wasted no time shifting the household into her preferred rhythm. She summoned Clara to her suite to unpack and organize the new purchases, giving exact instructions for where each item should be displayed. The gold hairdryer took pride of place on the vanity, its cord trailing dangerously close to the edge of the dressing table where the heavy curtains hung. That evening, instead of spending time with Ethan, Vanessa prepared for a late-night gathering of friends, champagne chilled, music cued, the dining room set with elaborate hors d'oeuvres. Staff were kept running until nearly midnight as laughter and clinking glasses echoed through the halls. Clara caught glimpses of strangers wandering into rooms they had no business being in, but Vanessa didn't seem to care. The once quiet estate now pulsed with a carelessness that felt foreign and threatening. By the time the guests left, the house was in disarray. Clara stayed late, tidying up the kitchen and making sure Ethan was settled in bed. She found him half asleep, clutching a small flashlight and a book about the moon's phases. "Is Dad home yet?" he mumbled, his voice thick with drowsiness. "Not yet, but soon," Clara assured him, tucking the blanket under his chin. Downstairs, the smell of spilled champagne still lingered, mixed with the faint scent of something metallic and overheated from the direction of Vanessa's suite. Clara dismissed it as remnants from the party, unaware that it was the first whisper of danger. Upstairs, the gold hairdryer sat on the vanity, cord still plugged into the wall, curtain brushing against its casing whenever the winter wind rattled the windows. The danger was silent for now, waiting. Clara, though exhausted, couldn't shake the feeling that the night had left more than just clutter behind. It had left an opening for something neither she nor anyone else in the house was prepared to face. The morning after Vanessa's late-night gathering dawned gray and cold, the kind of winter day where the sky felt heavy with unspoken warnings. Clara rose early, as she always did, to begin her duties in the kitchen. She found Emily already kneading bread, the smell of yeast warm in the air, and Jonas returning from the garden with frost clinging to his coat. Upstairs, Vanessa was in her suite, preparing for yet another social engagement, her hairdryer humming behind a closed door as she chatted on the phone about the party she was attending later that day. By mid-morning, she swept down the staircase in a fur-trimmed coat, calling over her shoulder to Mrs. Kent to make sure the suite is aired out before she returned. No one noticed, or perhaps no one dared to comment, that the cord to the gold hairdryer remained plugged in upstairs, its casing still faintly warm. Clara, unaware of the danger quietly poised in Vanessa's absence, focused on her morning chores, mopping the kitchen tiles until they gleamed. It started small, a whiff of smoke, barely noticeable over the aroma of Emily's baking bread. Jonas, working outside, caught sight of a faint gray plume escaping from an upper window and shouted, his voice sharp enough to slice through the winter stillness. Clara's head jerked up at the same moment the smoke alarm shrieked, a piercing sound that turned her blood cold. Dropping the mop, she sprinted toward the staircase, her mind leaping instantly to Ethan. The boy had gone to his room after breakfast, planning to read before lunch. Clara's first attempt to reach him was blocked by thick, acrid smoke rolling down the hallway like an unstoppable tide. Heat pressed against her skin, the air clawing at her lungs. She coughed hard, eyes stinging, and hesitated only long enough to pull her apron over her mouth before plunging forward. Every step felt like pushing through a furnace. Curtains along the hall lit with orange flames, and the floorboards beneath her feet were beginning to warp. She reached Ethan's door and banged it open to find him sitting up in bed, eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Come on, sweetheart," she called, scooping him into her arms without a second thought. The boy clung to her neck, coughing, his small body trembling. Clara turned back toward the hall, only to find the flames had doubled, heat slamming into her like a wall. Thinking fast, she ducked into the adjoining bathroom, smashed the latch on the window with her elbow, and pulled Ethan through the narrow opening into the ledge outside. From there, she guided him down the trellis Jonas had built for climbing roses, her hands scraped and raw by the time they reached the frozen ground. Behind them, the upper floor of the mansion roared with fire, black smoke curling into the sky. Clara's arms burned from both the weight of the boy and the searing heat she'd braved, but in that moment, the only thing she could hear was the thud of her own heartbeat and Ethan's ragged breathing against her shoulder. The scene outside the mansion was chaos, sirens screaming as two fire engines pulled up the winding driveway, red lights spinning against the pale winter sky. Jonas ran toward Clara and Ethan the moment they appeared from behind the garden wall, his face etched with panic. Emily followed, her apron dusted with flour, clutching a blanket she'd snatched from the kitchen sofa. Clara's knees nearly buckled as she passed Ethan into Jonas's arms so she could catch her breath, the cold air searing her lungs after the smoke. Paramedics rushed in, wrapping Ethan in the blanket, checking him for burns or smoke inhalation. One of them tried to guide Clara toward the ambulance as well, but she shook her head, eyes fixed on the boy. "I'm fine." "Check him first," she insisted, her voice hoarse. Over the roar of the fire, the sound of tires on gravel drew her attention, the black sedan returning at breakneck speed. Alexander stepped out before it had even stopped, his usual composure shattered by the sight before him. His gaze swept over the mansion's upper floor, now belching smoke, before locking onto Ethan. Alexander crossed the lawn in 3 long strides, pulling his son into his arms with a raw, desperate force that startled everyone watching. "Ethan, my boy. Are you hurt? Did you breathe in the smoke?" His voice cracked in a way none of the staff had ever heard. Ethan, still trembling, pointed toward Clara, who stood a few steps away, her clothes singed, soot smudged along her cheek. "She got me out," he said simply, eyes wide with the sincerity of a child who knew he'd been saved. Alexander turned to Clara, his voice low but thick with gratitude. "You risked your life for him." Clara swallowed, unable to meet his intense gaze, the adrenaline still hammering through her veins. Before she could find the right words, Ethan tugged at his father's lapel, leaning up to whisper something, but the words carried just far enough for those nearby to hear. "Marry Daddy." The air seemed to freeze around them. Clara blinked, certain she'd misheard, but Ethan was looking directly at her, his small face earnest despite the soot smudges. Alexander's brows rose slightly, a flicker of surprise breaking through his still-rattled expression. Jonas coughed to cover a chuckle, Emily looked down to hide her smile, and even one of the paramedics grinned before turning back to his work. Vanessa's absence hung over the moment like an unspoken question, but no one dared bring it up, not now, with the boy safe and the mansion still burning. Clara's heart pounded in a way entirely different from moments earlier. She managed a soft, nervous laugh and shook her head. "Let's just get you both inside and warm," she murmured, deflecting gently. But those 2 words, simple, innocent, and impossible to ignore, lodged themselves in the quiet corners of her mind, waiting for a time when they would no longer be just a child's wish but something far more complicated. The fire department worked through the rest of the afternoon, finally declaring the upper floor safe to enter, though the smell of smoke still clung to every surface. The damage was mostly confined to Vanessa's suite and the adjoining hallway: scorched curtains, blistered paint, charred furniture. Alexander stood in the center of the chaos, his arm protectively around Ethan, while the lead fire investigator explained they would need a full inspection to determine the cause. Vanessa arrived an hour later, stepping out of a hired car in a sequined cocktail dress, her hair perfectly styled. She feigned shock at the sight of the damage, clutching Alexander's arm and exclaiming how terrible it all was. Clara, standing with Emily near the kitchen entrance, watched the performance with a hollow feeling in her chest. Vanessa's reaction was too polished, too perfectly timed, as though she were playing to an invisible audience. In the days that followed, the mansion fell into an uneasy rhythm. Alexander thanked Clara privately, offering her paid time off to recover from her burns and the ordeal. She refused, saying she'd rather keep busy, though the skin on her forearms was tender under the bandages. Vanessa, meanwhile, seemed determined to downplay Clara's heroism. At dinner one evening, she remarked, "Well, anyone would have done the same," her tone dismissive enough to make Ethan's fork pause midair. Alexander said nothing, but Clara caught the way his eyes flicked toward her, studying her quiet composure. Behind the scenes, Vanessa began inserting herself into every conversation with the investigators, casually suggesting possible electrical faults or negligence by maintenance staff. Outside the Lancaster household, life continued. Emily's son returned from his military posting for a short visit, filling the kitchen with laughter and stories. Jonas entered his roses into the winter horticulture competition, proudly displaying the framed announcement on the staff room wall. Clara, in quieter moments, began drafting letters to hospitality schools, her dream of formal training still alive despite everything. But beneath these small pockets of normalcy, suspicion simmered. Clara couldn't forget the faint metallic heat she'd smelled in Vanessa's room the night before the fire, nor could she ignore how quick Vanessa had been to deflect attention elsewhere. The mansion's polished calm felt increasingly fragile, as though everyone was moving carefully over a frozen lake, knowing it could crack under the wrong weight. Clara didn't know it yet, but the truth about that fire would smolder far longer than the flames themselves. The first hint that the investigation was leaning toward something specific came on a Tuesday morning, when the lead investigator returned for a second round of interviews. He spoke briefly with Alexander in the study, then moved through the house with a camera, taking close-up shots of electrical outlets, scorch marks, and appliance cords. By evening, quiet rumors began to circulate among the staff that the fire had started in Vanessa's suite, not in the wiring or the roof as she'd been hinting. Clara overheard Mrs. Kent telling Jonas in hushed tones that the burn pattern near the vanity was too neat to be anything but a single point of origin. Ethan, sensitive to the tension, began avoiding the main floor entirely whenever Vanessa was around. He spent most of his afternoons in the library with Clara, his head bent over sketchbooks while she polished the shelves. One afternoon, Clara caught a glimpse of Vanessa in the kitchen, her voice low and sharp as she cornered Emily near the pantry door. "When guests are here, I expect everything perfect." "No excuses," Vanessa hissed, before sweeping out without even acknowledging Clara's presence. Emily's hand shook slightly as she returned to kneading dough. "She's worse when he's away," Emily murmured, meaning Alexander, and Clara felt the truth of that in her bones. She'd seen Vanessa's temper up close now, the way it was wielded like a scalpel, designed to make people doubt themselves rather than explode outright. In the grand rooms of the mansion, Vanessa was elegance incarnate; in the shadows, she was something else entirely. Richard Marlowe, ever the keen observer, paid a visit later that week. Over coffee in the sunroom with Alexander, his voice carried just enough for Clara to catch fragments as she dusted the hallway table. "Public perception matters, Alex. And right now." "Well, whispers get louder when you don't address them." Alexander's reply was too low to hear, but when he emerged, his expression was darker than Clara had ever seen it. That evening, as Clara tucked Ethan into bed, he asked her if people could pretend to be nice forever. She hesitated before answering, "Not forever. Pretending always cracks sooner or later." It was a simple truth, but in the Lancaster estate, it felt like a quiet prophecy. The mask Vanessa wore was starting to fracture, and Clara sensed that once it broke, the fallout would be impossible to contain. The confirmation came on a biting February morning, when the fire investigators returned for a final debrief with Alexander in his study. Though the doors were closed, word spread quickly through the staff corridors. The blaze had started from an unattended hairdryer in Vanessa's suite. The cord had been left plugged in and switched on, resting close enough to the heavy curtains to ignite them once the motor overheated. It was no faulty wiring, no act of God, just negligence, simple and damning. Vanessa called it an accident, insisting she must have forgotten in the rush to attend an important charity function. But the statement rang hollow, even to those who didn't dare voice their opinions aloud. Clara, carrying fresh linens down the hall, overheard the clipped edge in Alexander's voice as he asked Vanessa why the dryer had been running at all when she wasn't even in the room. Her airy dismissal, "Do you expect me to remember every tiny thing?" was enough to make Clara grip the folded sheets tighter. Ethan's truth came later that evening, when Alexander found him in the library, sketchbook open but untouched. The boy looked up, his face serious in a way that seemed too old for 7. "Dad, I don't like her," he said quietly. "She's mean to Emily and Jonas. And to Clara. And she doesn't want me here." Alexander's heart tightened. He'd suspected, but hearing it from Ethan, raw and unfiltered, cut deeper than any investigator's report. He asked gentle questions, encouraging Ethan to speak freely, and by the end of the conversation, the list of small cruelties painted a picture far darker than Alexander had imagined. The thought that his son had endured them in silence ignited a slow, cold anger. That night, Alexander and Vanessa dined together in the formal dining room, the tension between them thick enough to choke on. Clara served quietly, her eyes fixed on the crystal glasses, but she could feel the weight of unspoken words pressing against the walls. After dinner, Alexander asked to speak to Vanessa in private. Staff didn't hear what was said, but the tone was unmistakable, a measured, icy calm that carried more weight than shouting ever could. Vanessa emerged from the study much later, her expression set and her stride sharp, the click of her heels echoing down the marble hall. Clara didn't need to be told, something fundamental had shifted. The truth was no longer a question, it was a fact, and now it was only a matter of time before the consequences arrived. The days that followed were marked by a cold civility between Alexander and Vanessa, the kind of brittle politeness that suggested the ice beneath them was already cracking. Vanessa still appeared at breakfast, impeccably dressed, still posted smiling photos from charity luncheons and art openings, but in the private spaces of the Lancaster estate, she and Alexander barely spoke. Clara noticed Alexander spending more time in his study or in the garden with Ethan, his phone calls with Henry Cole, his long-trusted lawyer, becoming more frequent and hushed. The staff, though careful not to gossip openly, exchanged knowing looks in the kitchen. Even Mrs. Kent's measured tone carried a faint undercurrent of anticipation, as though she were quietly bracing for an inevitable storm. Vanessa, sensing the shift, grew restless. One afternoon, Clara passed the open door of the east sitting room and heard Vanessa on the phone, her voice low but urgent. "If he thinks he can just walk away, he's mistaken. I'll take my share, more than my share, if I have to burn every bridge to do it." Clara kept moving, her footsteps deliberately steady so as not to be caught listening, but the words lodged themselves in her mind like a splinter. That evening, Vanessa's demeanor toward Clara was sharper than usual, her instructions more exacting, as though punishing her for something unspoken. It was becoming clear that Vanessa was not going to leave quietly. By the end of the week, Alexander's decision was official. Henry Cole arrived at the estate with a slim leather briefcase, and behind the closed door of the study, the divorce proceedings began to take shape. Clara was summoned briefly, not for personal reasons, but as a witness to several incidents she had seen: Vanessa's harsh treatment of Ethan, her berating of staff, the night of the fire. Speaking the truth aloud in that formal setting made Clara uneasy, but she sensed Alexander's quiet gratitude in the way he met her gaze afterward. Vanessa, however, was not done. The following day, she left the house in a swirl of perfume and silk, and by evening, rumors began appearing online, snippets in gossip blogs painting Alexander as controlling, even cold. It was a tactic meant to erode his reputation before the legal battle began. The war, Clara realized, had shifted from quiet corridors to public arenas, and every player in the Lancaster household was now caught in the crossfire. The first day in court was a spectacle Vanessa seemed to savor. She arrived in a tailored cream suit and oversized sunglasses, the flash of photographers' cameras reflecting off her diamond earrings as she swept up the courthouse steps. Inside, her legal team, 3 lawyers with expensive pens and even more expensive egos, spread out folders thick with accusations. Clara sat quietly in the back, flanked by Emily and Jonas, while Alexander, calm in a dark navy suit, leaned over to confer with Henry Cole. Vanessa's claim was bold. She demanded half of Alexander's empire, citing emotional labor and shared contributions to his businesses. The courtroom murmured at the audacity, but Vanessa's confident smirk never faltered. Clara felt Ethan's absence beside her. He had been spared the tension of the opening day, but she knew his voice would eventually be part of this trial. As proceedings unfolded, Henry dismantled Vanessa's narrative piece by piece. He presented records of Alexander's businesses dating back years before the marriage, evidence of separate financial accounts, and sworn testimonies from employees about Vanessa's minimal involvement in any professional matters. When Emily was called to the stand, she spoke with steady dignity about her years of service to the Lancasters, recounting Vanessa's unreasonable demands, her belittling remarks toward Ethan, and her disinterest in the household's welfare. Jonas followed, describing incidents where Vanessa's actions jeopardized the safety of the estate, subtle references to her negligence the night of the fire woven seamlessly into his account. Clara's own testimony came on the second day, her voice low but unwavering as she described not just Vanessa's treatment of Ethan, but also the precise sequence of events during the fire. Midway through the trial, the judge requested a closed session to hear Ethan's statement, recorded privately with a court-appointed child advocate. His words, though simple, carried the sharp ring of truth. She didn't like me. She told me I made too much noise. Clara was my friend. She saved me. When the session resumed, the judge's expression had changed, his tone colder toward Vanessa's side. By the final day, it was clear the momentum was entirely in Alexander's favor. The ruling came swiftly, the prenuptial agreement was upheld, Vanessa would receive nothing from his businesses or personal wealth. Vanessa's face barely flickered in response, but her grip on her designer handbag whitened as the gavel fell. The legal battle was over, but in Clara's gut, she knew this was not the last strike Vanessa would attempt. People like her didn't surrender, they recalculated. And the next move, Clara feared, might not come in a courtroom at all. For a brief moment after the ruling, the Lancaster estate felt almost peaceful. Vanessa had moved out under the guise of needing time for herself, leaving the staff to restore the damaged suite and air out the lingering traces of her perfume. Alexander returned his focus to work, Ethan laughed more freely, and Clara allowed herself to believe that perhaps the worst was over. But that illusion cracked one frosty morning when Henry Cole arrived unexpectedly, a grim expression on his face. He carried an alert from Alexander's private bank, an attempted breach on one of his offshore accounts. The digital trail was messy, clumsy, and yet unmistakable. It traced directly back to Vanessa. The news sent a cold ripple through the kitchen where Clara, Emily, and Jonas were having their morning tea. Emily muttered, "She's not done with him," and Jonas simply shook his head, his jaw tight. Alexander wasted no time. He contacted the authorities, who began their own investigation into the hacking attempt. The more they uncovered, the more brazen Vanessa's scheme appeared. She had hired 2 amateur hackers through an acquaintance in her social circle, offering them a cut of whatever they could siphon off. What she hadn't counted on was the sophistication of Alexander's banking security and the bank's rapid response. Within 48 hours, the police had enough evidence to issue a warrant. Clara was in the front hall arranging fresh flowers when she saw the black and white patrol cars pull into the driveway of Vanessa's rented townhouse. News traveled quickly. She had been arrested on charges of attempted fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. The scandal spread like wildfire through the city's upper circles. Once admiring acquaintances distanced themselves overnight, and her name became a cautionary tale whispered at luncheons and charity events. Yet for all the vindication the arrest brought, Clara couldn't shake the unease that lingered. Vanessa was resourceful in her spite, and people like her often had one last card to play, even from behind bars. Alexander, for his part, kept his composure but became more guarded, his trust narrowed to a tight circle. Ethan sensed the shift and began staying closer to his father and to Clara, instinctively gravitating toward the 2 people who had proven themselves unshakable. As winter's ice began to thaw outside, the household braced itself, not for Vanessa's return, but for the slow work of healing from the shadows she had left behind. What none of them knew was that the next chapter of their lives would bring a warmth none had dared to hope for. Spring came slowly to the Lancaster estate, the snow retreating in ragged patches until the lawns were soft again underfoot. For the first time in months, the house felt alive in a way that wasn't tense or performative. Alexander decided to take Ethan away for a week to the coast, a quiet stretch of shoreline in Maine where the Atlantic curled in gentle waves and gulls cried overhead. Clara was invited along, ostensibly to help with Ethan, but she quickly realized Alexander wanted her there for more than just practical reasons. The trip was a bomb. Mornings were spent walking along the damp sand, Ethan darting ahead to collect shells while Clara trailed after him with a smile. Evenings were quiet affairs, the three of them sharing simple meals in the cozy beach house Alexander had rented. It was during those dinners that Clara noticed how Alexander's gaze lingered a little longer, his questions about her life carrying a warmth that hadn't been there before. Away from the grandeur of the estate, Alexander was different, less guarded, more willing to laugh, even at himself. One afternoon, when Ethan insisted they all try skipping stones, Clara caught him smiling at her after she managed 3 skips in a row. He told her about his own childhood summers, fishing off rocky piers with his father before business consumed his family's time. Clara shared stories of her small coastal hometown, of mending fishing nets with her father and the way the sea air smelled different after storms. In those moments, she felt the lines between employer and employee blur in ways that were both comforting and dangerous. Ethan, oblivious to any subtext, simply thrived in the easy companionship, his cheeks pink from sun and laughter. By the time they returned to the estate, the change between them was subtle but undeniable. Clara resumed her duties, yet Alexander sought her out more often, sharing coffee in the kitchen before heading into the city, asking for her opinion on minor household decisions, listening when she spoke. Clara also reconnected with her mother during this time, calling more frequently and hearing hopeful news. The treatments were working, and her health was improving. For the first time in years, Clara allowed herself to think about the future not just in terms of survival, but possibility. Still, she moved carefully, aware of how quickly such peace could shatter. Vanessa's shadow had receded, but the memory of her presence was a reminder. Fragility lingered, even in seasons of healing. The first sign of the tide truly turning came in the form of a thick envelope, its return address marked from a prestigious hospitality school in Boston. Clara found it waiting for her on the small desk in her room one evening, her name written in careful script. She opened it with trembling hands and scanned the words twice before it sank in. Her application had been accepted. A smile broke across her face, quickly followed by uncertainty. The tuition, even with partial scholarships, was more than she could comfortably afford, especially while still supporting her mother. When she mentioned it over breakfast the next morning, Alexander set down his coffee cup and said without hesitation, "I'll cover the rest. Consider it an investment in someone I believe in." The sincerity in his tone left Clara momentarily speechless. Ethan, sitting between them, grinned wide. "Does that mean you'll still be here?" he asked. Clara laughed softly, assuring him she wouldn't leave until the time was right. Ethan's attachment to her had grown into something deeper than simple fondness. That afternoon, while they were working together in the library on one of his school projects, he blurted out, "I wish you could be my mom." The words were innocent but carried a surprising weight. Clara paused, unsure how to respond, her heart tightening with both joy and caution. She gently redirected the conversation to his work, but his statement lingered with her long after he bounded off to join Jonas in the garden. Later, she caught Alexander watching them from the French doors, an unreadable expression on his face. For a moment, she wondered if he'd overheard. Richard Marlowe made an unexpected visit that weekend, bringing Ethan a model rocket kit and teasing Alexander about his softened edges. Over glasses of wine in the sunroom, Clara overheard him say, "If you're not careful, you're going to fall for the Maid." Alexander's quiet chuckle in response was too low for her to interpret. Still, the thought stayed with her, both thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. She had worked hard to remain professional, to keep her role clearly defined, but the boundaries were blurring, carried away by a current she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to resist. The tides in the Lancaster household were shifting, and though no one spoke of it outright, everyone, especially Clara, could feel the pull of something inevitable. It was one of those rare spring evenings when the garden seemed to breathe, every rose and lilac heavy with scent, the air soft enough to carry voices farther than intended. Clara had been arranging flowers in the conservatory when Alexander appeared in the doorway, hands in his pockets, and asked if she'd walk with him. They followed the gravel path toward the west garden, where the sunset turned the estate's stone walls a warm gold. For a while, they spoke of simple things: Jonas's roses winning another ribbon, Emily's excitement over her son's upcoming return visit, but when they reached the fountain at the center of the lawn, Alexander stopped. "Clara," he began, his voice low, "I owe you more than gratitude for what you've done for Ethan. And for me." The pause that followed seemed to stretch across the length of the garden. "I've realized I care for you in a way I haven't cared for anyone since Isabella." Clara felt the ground tilt, not in alarm, but in the shock of something she had imagined yet never expected to hear aloud. She searched his face, finding no trace of jest, only sincerity and a hint of vulnerability. "Alexander," she started, but words faltered under the weight of the moment. Her heart thudded in her chest, torn between the warmth his admission sparked and the caution that had guided her since she first stepped into the Lancaster estate. "I don't know if that's wise," she admitted, her voice barely above the murmur of the fountain. He didn't press, only nodded, as if he'd anticipated her hesitation. "I understand," he said, but the way his gaze lingered told her he wasn't retreating from the truth he'd just shared. For days afterward, the conversation played over in Clara's mind. She continued her work as before, careful not to alter her routine, yet the air between them felt changed, charged with unspoken possibilities. Ethan seemed to sense it, his joy around them doubled, as though the idea of them together was a wish he'd been nurturing quietly all along. One evening, when Clara brought Ethan a cup of cocoa before bed, he grinned and whispered, "You make Dad happy." She smiled but said nothing, unwilling to step into promises she wasn't ready to make. Still, as she left his room and caught Alexander's eyes in the hallway, she knew a line had been crossed in the garden that could never be uncrossed. What remained uncertain was whether stepping fully over it would bring them closer to peace, or into the kind of storm they'd only just survived. Summer arrived with a softness that seemed to seep into every corner of the Lancaster estate. The gardens were in full bloom, Jonas's roses spilling over in rich reds and creamy whites, the air carrying the perfume of hydrangeas and freshly cut grass. Ethan's laughter echoed more often now, and Clara found herself joining in without the shadow of restraint that had once tempered her joy. Alexander had been quieter in recent weeks, not distant but deliberate, as though carrying a secret he wasn't yet ready to share. That secret revealed itself one golden evening when he invited Clara and Ethan to the West Garden to see something new Jonas had planted. When they arrived, the space had been transformed, lanterns strung from tree branches, a small table set with crystal glasses, and at the center of the lawn, Ethan standing beside a telescope, his eyes sparkling with mischief. Clara approached, curious, and Ethan handed her a small velvet box he'd been hiding behind his back. "It's inside the telescope," he whispered, giggling. Confused, she leaned down, and when she straightened, Alexander was in front of her, no longer the guarded billionaire but a man entirely bare in his emotion. "Clara Dawson," he began, his voice steady but rich with feeling, "you came into our lives as a light in a dark place. You've given my son laughter, my home peace, and me hope. Will you marry me?" The moment seemed to suspend itself, the scent of roses, the glow of lanterns, Ethan's eager face, all blending into something that felt timeless. Clara's eyes stung, her voice caught, but she managed to nod through her tears. "Yes," she breathed, the word both fragile and certain. Ethan threw his arms around them both, his small voice muffled against Clara's side. "Now it's official," he declared, as if this had been his plan all along since the day of the fire. Alexander slipped the ring onto Clara's finger, a delicate design of white gold and a single, luminous sapphire that seemed to catch the last of the sun. In that moment, the long months of tension, fear, and uncertainty seemed to dissolve, replaced by the kind of calm that feels both hard-earned and endlessly fragile. The staff would later tell the story as though it were a scene from a film, each detail burnished over time, but for Clara, it was simply the moment her life shifted from surviving each day to truly living it. What neither she nor Alexander could have known was that their next chapter, though full of promise, would require them to redefine everything they thought they understood about family, loyalty, and love. The wedding was small by Lancaster standards but perfect in every way that mattered. The estate's west garden, where Alexander had proposed, became the ceremony's centerpiece. Rows of white chairs lined the lawn, draped in satin ribbons that fluttered in the warm breeze. Emily bustled in the kitchen from dawn, preparing an array of her best dishes, while Jonas oversaw the floral arrangements, his prized roses climbing the arch under which Clara and Alexander would exchange vows. Veronica arrived early, embracing Clara as though she'd been waiting for this day for years. "You're exactly what this family needed," she whispered, her eyes bright. Ethan wore a little navy suit and stood proudly as Alexander's best man, his grin wide enough to rival the sun. Clara's dress was simple yet elegant, the ivory silk moving like water as she walked toward Alexander, who watched her with the kind of look that silenced every voice in the garden. The vows were heartfelt, carrying the weight of all they had endured. Alexander spoke first, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "You walked into our lives with no promise of reward, only the courage to care. You've given Ethan safety, and me the kind of love I thought I'd lost forever. I promise to honor you, protect you, and cherish you for the rest of my life." Clara's reply trembled with sincerity. "You gave me a place when I had none, and in you and Ethan, I found my home. I promise to stand with you, through every season and every storm." When they sealed their vows with a kiss, Ethan cheered so loudly that the guests laughed, the sound carrying high into the summer air. It was not the grandeur of the setting but the truth in their eyes that made the moment unforgettable. The celebration flowed into the evening, lanterns glowing against the deepening sky, music drifting from the string quartet under the oak trees. Staff and family mingled freely, the boundaries between them erased by genuine joy. Clara's mother, healthier now and standing beside Veronica, wiped tears as she watched her daughter dance with Alexander for the first time as his wife. Ethan darted between tables, showing guests the telescope he had set up near the fountain, insisting they look at the stars. As the night wound down, Alexander took Clara's hand and led her to the balcony overlooking the gardens. "This is just the beginning," he murmured. Clara smiled, knowing he was right, not because life would be without challenges, but because for the first time, she faced the future not as a maid in someone else's house, but as a wife, a mother, and a partner in a home that was truly hers. The Lancaster estate, once a place of shadows and tension, now felt alive with warmth, laughter, and the steady promise of new beginnings. The end. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, like and comment, and also share to your loved ones or anyone who might be interested. Turn on post notification after subscribing so you get informed on our next video. Thank you, and I'd see you next time. Bye for now.